Our gospel reading this morning is from the 25th chapter of Matthew, some of the final public teachings of Jesus prior to the events of his passion that will shortly begin. It is part of a group of teachings which are directed to the situation of what are the followers of Jesus to do after he is gone in that interval between Easter and his return. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. Jesus says, "For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours.' But his master replied, 'You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Most congregations have a story or two about doing the impossible. There's the congregation that was formed in the midst of the Great Depression, when everyone said it was a foolish time to try and start a church. But there was a group of people who felt called and who saw a need for a congregation in their community, and so in spite of the difficult times and financial hardships, a congregation was born and thrived. There's the congregation that felt a call to begin a comprehensive ministry to the poor in their community. They dreamed of taking an abandoned store that was near them and converting it into a facility with job training, food pantry, health clinic, and after-school tutoring. The rent on the old storefront was more than their small budget could manage, and they did not have sufficient volunteers. But the leadership of the church decided to do it anyway, trusting that they would find the money and they would find the volunteers. And despite all the obstacles, a new ministry was born and thrived. There is the famous story of the youth group at Spring Valley Presbyterian Church in Columbia, South Carolina, gathered for a Super Bowl party. there a seminary intern offered a prayer, asking that as they enjoyed their festivities and their food, that they be mindful of those who had nothing to eat. And some in the youth group wanted to do more than just be mindful. But what can a youth group do in the face of something so big as poverty and hunger? Still, they contacted other youth groups in the Columbia area, and the next Super Bowl, together they collected around $6,000 to give to hunger ministries. And the Super Bowl of Caring was born and thrived. And since 1990, it has collected over $100 million for hunger ministries, including over $8 million this year alone. There are countless such stories. No doubt some who've been around Falls Church Pres for a long time know some impossible stories from this congregation that I haven't heard, and I would love to hear them from you. But there are many times in many congregations when someone offered a provocative prayer or someone pointed out a pressing need and nothing happened. There are many things that work against doing the impossible. Many of us are afflicted by a fear of failure. And churches in particular can be paralyzed by this fear. Money, or the lack of money, can often seem an insurmountable obstacle. And worries about where the money will come from can feed our fear of failure. In our day, many congregations worry about simply surviving. Nearly every denomination in America is suffering significant numerical decline, and there are many congregations who worry they won't be here much longer. The millennial generation is more disconnected from the church than any in recent history, and some church folks are worried, and people who are worried about survival tend to get timid and cautious and rarely risk impossible things. The people for whom Matthew's gospel was originally written were surely worried about their survival. These were Jews who followed the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. But life was not all that easy for Jewish Christians in the latter part of the first century. The Romans had destroyed Jerusalem along with its spectacular temple, and only a few years before Matthew is written. And while that had in fact fulfilled Jesus' sayings about the destruction of the temple, it had also thrown Judaism into disarray. With the loss of the temple, priestly Judaism, focused on offering sacrifices and other offerings, had disappeared. And rabbinical synagogue Judaism had become the dominant power, that movement begun by reform-minded Pharisees. Jewish Christians, who also called the synagogue home, began to find themselves labeled heretics. They were told, be quiet about Jesus if you want to remain members of the synagogue. And they did want to remain members of the synagogue. And it is precisely for these Jewish Christians that Matthew recalls today's parable. It is a favorite parable of mine, and it is also, I suspect, one of the more misunderstood parables, often treated as though it was a fable with a moral, use your talents wisely. But of course, for Matthew's original audience, the talent was simply a whole lot of money. roughly 15 years' wages of the typical worker. And in the parable, Jesus tells of a master who leaves slaves 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talent respectively. If we were to update that and we use a modest $20,000 annual salary, the master leaves the slaves $1.5 million, $600,000, $300,000, and goes away. Now imagine for a moment that you have a boss, a harsh and difficult boss, and he comes to you and says, "Here's $1 million of my dollars. Take care of it for me while I'm gone." What would you do? How many of you would rush out and invest it in some risky venture that might make a fortune, but might also lose it all? How many of you would choose something safe, perhaps with federal insurance? Even at today's pathetic interest rates, a little income might be better than having to tell the boss, "Oops, I lost your money." If you would choose a safe money market CD or savings account, then congratulations, you chose the same thing that the slave with the 1 talent chose. I know that the parable itself mentions investing with the bankers, but remember that in Jesus' day there was no such things as banks as we know them, and on top of that, the law of Moses forbid lending money at interest. And so it is quite likely that every single member of Matthew's congregation who first heard this parable would have done precisely the same thing the 3rd slave did, the only safe thing, truly safe thing, and they would have hidden the money. But for some crazy reason, 2 of the slaves go out and they wheel and they deal with their master's money, and they double what he gave them. Now, how many of you know an investment where I can double what I have in fairly short order? If so, I'd like to talk to you right after the service. Maybe a better question is, if you were on the session of this church, that's our governing council, how inclined would you be to put the church's holdings in a risky investment that might double what we have? Today's parable, as I said before, is one of a series of teachings that speak to how the followers of Jesus are to live and to act in that time between Easter and Christ's eventual return. They speak to Matthew's congregation, which is tempted to go underground, to hole up and wait and play it safe. They speak as well to congregations in our day, direct heirs of Matthew's congregations who know all about being careful and playing it safe. And to Matthew's congregation and to us, Jesus says, take big chances. Do the impossible. Now, of course, Jesus isn't speaking of just any big chance or any impossibility. He is speaking of the treasure of the gospel we have been given and our call to show God's kingdom to the world, that new reality that is present in Jesus and that is present in us when we live by its ways. And so, where is it that Jesus is calling us to take big risks, and to do the impossible. Where is Jesus calling us to step out on faith, trusting that when we are faithful to His call, when we allow the Spirit to work through us, when we risk ourselves for the sake of the gospel, impossible things do happen. All praise and glory to the one who pours out the Spirit on us, that we might be the living body of Christ in and for the world.